Welcome to Generation Hope, a podcast by connect.faith. My name is Cali, and this season we're focusing around the theme of identity. I'll be having conversations with a wide variety of young adults, with the goal of building empathy and understanding between communities. So today I am speaking with Sam Rosenblatt, who is a theater maker based in New York. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. All right, so I thought we can just start if you could kind of introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. So I'm Sam Rosenblatt. As you said, I'm a theater maker in New York, which means I wear lots of different hats in the theater. I'm primarily a lyricist, book writer. Words for musicals, but also I love to stage manage. I love doing props. My current favorite thing to do is making sock puppets. So I'm a little all over the place, directing, choreographing, acting, kind of whatever is needed, I guess. I went to NYU for both undergrad and my master's. I have a Bachelor of Science in Educational Theater and also a Master's MFA in musical theater writing, which is very fancy, but really just meant did a lot of writing over the past few years. Graduated into the pandemic and kind of just decided to keep busy with theater. So wore a lot of hats during that time too.
And here you are.
And here we are.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the introduction that this season we're talking about identity and like how different parts of who we are go into what we do in our everyday lives. So if somebody was to ask you, what are the pieces of identity, or essentially what makes up who you are as a person, what would you say?
I'm going to boil your question down in a different way, I think.
Go for it.
I believe, and you spoke in your intro about empathy, and I think that that's really what theater is about to me. And so different aspects of my personality and my heritage, I'm Jewish, Asian American. I've got a lot of different mental health problems that I'm always working through. I'm queer. I think that all those things really play into the empathy that I find when I work in theater. And so I think those aspects of my identity have really shaped the stories I want to tell and how I tell them and how I react to different things in the theater.
I love that. You're looking for empathy in the world and you kind of found it in the way you're able to make art through theater. That's awesome. So why don't you take us back to the beginning a little bit and tell us why musical theater, why Broadway, why a world that gets you both into sock puppets and writing a musical, quite literally. Maybe even in the same week, who knows?
Truly in the same week, actually last week was Sock Puppet Musical Theater Week. I was 3, I think, and my mom signed me up for a performance camp, a theater camp. I was a Dalmatian soloist in 101 Dalmatians. I sang Where Oh Where Has My Little Dog Gone, and it just took off from there. I think in middle school I decided that I really wanted to major at NYU in educational theater. Decision pretty early on, I guess, 6th grade, I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. I'm, very much into youth theater as a kid, and I think I really started as a performer. And then from there, stage manager, I guess, was next, and then props. And then somewhere around my junior year of college, we had to do an assignment where we wrote a musical, or we wrote an adaptation of some sort of a book of Chrysanthemum. And I wrote a very short musical with my very good friend, Rai Arsa Arta. And then we were lucky enough to get to do our final projects in an off-Broadway space. And we had,
cool.
We had lots of families come and seeing like kids light up when they were like, oh, my name is a little different too, like Chrysanthemum. And this spoke to me. And I was like, wow, like seeing the difference you could make, I think at that point was like this is what I want to do. I want to write stories and tell stories that maybe don't always get brought to the surface.
Yeah. And I think maybe even in the last 2 years, for me at least, I've really seen the impact that can have of people seeing themselves represented, whether it's on a stage or on a screen or in a book. Like you said, seeing the impact you had of somebody who could relate to your story, and that it can start so young, that it was kids who were saying that to you. Yeah, that's really cool. So, you fell in love with theater, you fell in love with the educational aspect, the youth aspect, the idea that your words could make such an impact. When did you decide, I want to go into the writing aspect more?
Yeah, I think that Chrysanthemum production was really the turning point for me.
Yeah.
And then after that, I wrote with Rai Arsaarta, and then my friend Noah, who I hadn't worked with in a composer capacity, but I'd worked with as an actor, as a director. We'd done everything together. And I roped Rai in, and we had a show called Found a New Musical premiere at New York Winterfest, my senior year of college. I took a class the following semester that was taught by Kirsten Childs and Joel Durfner, who have written tons of off-Broadway and published works, and they really inspired me to apply to the graduate musical theater writing program at Tisch. So right out of undergrad, that's where I was going. I got accepted, met some really incredible people there. I'm still friends with, most of my cycle, and we all worked together in lots of different ways. I'm currently stage managing for two of them who have actually written a queer adaptation of Pride and Prejudice called Charlotte Lucas is 27 and Not Dead.
I love that.
It's so good. It's a pop rock inspired score with period time speaking and British accents, but then we break out of it and we do pop songs, and it's super fun. So met them at GMTWP, and now we're still working together.
That's awesome. You were really able to kind of network and and find people to continue to partner with. That's really cool. So you mentioned earlier a lot of things that go into making up your perspective, right? You mentioned you're Jewish, Asian American, queer, you're on a journey with your mental health. How do all of those pieces of who you are go into what you write and the stories that you're trying to portray?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So I am lucky that I have found, I think, my forever collaborator, Elspeth Collard, who shares many of the same values as me. And our first show that we wrote is called A Princess Story. It is a TYA, Theater for Young Audiences show with a princess who has pretty much a realization about classism and about her sexuality and how she plays into the world. And the difference that she really can make. And there's also a boy band of knights and a four-headed dragon. That's
beautiful.
Kind of where we are at with that one. But yeah, I think that it's so important to me to, like you said, have representation on stage. So we're very dedicated to having a woman of color in that leading role as the princess. Because as a woman of color, I didn't see myself growing up on the stage in that way. I was always the geeky Asian girl or, something like that on TV. And I think it's really important for kids to see an accurate representation of their world. I always think in undergrad, my professor, Joe Salvatore, was talking about The Lion King and how it doesn't, Lion King on Broadway, and it doesn't mean as much to us to go and see it. But then if you take a kid who's maybe not seeing himself in a role as a king, and that moment when you see the very first, you see people of color walk on stage and they are the royalty, that hits so hard. I just got chills thinking about that moment in class. But it just hits so differently when you can see yourself accurately represented in like a fully fledged character that you can relate to all different aspects to. So I think in that way, I think that's really important to how I tell stories, is I want to see characters that are fully formed, that aren't just like the geek, you know?
Right. Playing into the stereotypes that we see them.
Exactly. Yeah. And if it is going to be a stereotype, why? You know, dive deep into that, like really hit it hard. And then I think also just telling like stories that represent our world and our generation. You know, I was joking around with one of the actors in Charlotte Lucas, and we were talking about how like we grew up on anarchy, essentially, but starting very young with like A Bug's Life, you know?
Yeah.
And getting to see where we are now from that point, I think that's really fascinating, and I love exploring what it means to fight against constraints of society.
Yeah. You saying A Bug's Life made me think of the movie Shark's Tale, where like, you know, the little fish that could. But I also found it really interesting that you went right for, what was the acronym you used? It was for a young audience.
TYA.
TYA. There it is. Now I sound official. But that your first instinct was to do something for kids, or at least a younger audience. I wonder if you've ever had, because I think about kind of the things that I see in the headlines when, for example, I remember a teacher in the PBS show Arthur, like married, the male teacher was married to a man, and there was like so much controversy and so much pushback. And so I wonder, when you're telling these stories that really challenge kids to think harder, do you ever experience any of that pushback?
Yeah, I'd say, so A Princess Story has not had a full production. It was written mostly during the pandemic. But I have been lucky that the audiences who have been able to see it, you know, in a Zoom format or a pre-recorded format, we've had pretty much, you know, positive comments and thoughts on it. But I do think there's still a stigma about like young kids, you know, seeing two women kiss on stage. I mean, I think too, when the prom had that in the Thanksgiving Day parade, and everyone was like, oh, and I was like, I don't know. I think for me, I don't see the difference between a man and a woman kissing and two women kissing, or two men kissing, or non-binary, or whatever, you know. I think it's just like, they're just people. We're all just people. And if there's an affection there, I don't see the difference, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that was beautifully said. I love that. So I guess another thing that I'm wondering about when it comes to kind of pushback and trying to tell stories that are often underrepresented, or that we just don't get to see from different perspectives that much. I don't think it's a secret that Broadway is historically run by affluent white men. So I wonder, for you, coming in as a writer of color, do you ever face any prejudices or feel like maybe you didn't belong in a room, even though you have clearly the talent and every right to be there? Did you ever get that feeling of, this space isn't as welcoming as I wish it was? Because I think Broadway is so weird in that we have this history of it, but it seems to be the organization that's constantly like claiming the progressive agenda, right? Progressive agenda. But that was in air quotes if you're just listening. But Broadway is almost seen as the most progressive industry, and yet it seems like when you pull back the curtain, that's not always the case when it comes to, you know, the writer's room or whatever it is. So how have you seen any of that playing out?
I have absolutely seen and felt that way. I actually, one of my collaborators who I produce a bi-monthly concert series with, his name is Daryl Young, and we did an interview with Broadway World in the beginning of the pandemic, I guess. And it was about us both being Asian writers, and we both had this very similar experience where we are in a class or a room and someone was like, oh yeah, Miss Saigon, and every head turned to look at us. And it's like, cool. Let's not.
Yeah.
So in some ways, like, it's exciting to see, like, Hamilton have such a diverse cast. And then there's also shows that are like, you know, they're still casting only white actors. And especially behind the table, I think now, there's a big problem with writers who are white tackling issues that are maybe harder for them to empathize with. I'm trying to put this in a way that isn't going to come off terribly, but
they're writing stories that aren't maybe theirs to tell.
Yes, exactly. And I think there is a not to say like you shouldn't tell a story, because I think it's a very complex issue, like, of what is your story to tell. But I also think there's a difference between, like, two, you know, cis, hetero white men telling a story about a woman of color who has been, let's say, sexually assaulted, and then, like, a woman telling that story. I think there's a very big difference there. Yeah. And to go back to your original question, I think it's how it's handled in the room. I think it's how they are open to feedback and hearing those stories and empathizing and sympathizing with the people who have actually lived through those experiences.
Yeah. I think it's really important for people to hear that even if you have great intentions in trying to tell a story, it's important to then be open to feedback and be open to maybe inviting in somebody, like, as a researcher to help you write that story. Or there's so many different ways to be more welcoming and inviting in a creative process than what we're currently seeing.
Absolutely. Bringing in those dramaturgs, those researchers who can provide that perspective and, like, also historical context, I think is something that's really important. I'm currently working on a show called Like the Wind with my collaborator Elspeth, and it is about two queer teenagers running away from conversion therapy in the summer of 2018. And we are constantly doing research, you know, right. Reading interviews, reading novels, you know, anything we can get, because we're both fortunate enough to have not been put through that situation.
Right.
We both are queer, we both empathize with that side of it, you know, and feeling like we've been othered or we're not in the same, you know, we're not invited into this room. And so I think we're really drawing on that and trying to find the empathy there. But at the same time, like, we want to tell an honest story. And I think that is my whole thing, is like telling honest stories.
And I'm sure people are going to go see your show or hear your show, and it's evident when that time and energy and research has been put into it. You can kind of feel the amount of effort that was put into creating an honest story. You know when that's happened. So you mentioned a little bit that you mentioned, this show was written during COVID and that you graduated right at the height of COVID. How have you, just how have you done it, I guess, is the basis of this question. But, you know, Broadway just reopened, 3 or 4 weeks ago, the first Broadway show came back. So you have been starting your career in the middle of this and honestly thriving. Like, I've been watching what you're doing, and you have stuff going on all the time, as you've hinted at during this interview. But I guess I'm just curious, like, how did COVID impact all of these great big plans you had and these projects you wanted to work on?
Oh boy. All right. So I, as you said, graduated with my MFA in May of 2020. We were remote as of March 12th, which if you've ever tried to like collaborate and write a musical over Zoom, it's really hard.
Yeah, I
There
can
were
imagine.
a lot of late nights with my collaborator, Steven. We were working on this show called Night Witches, which will someday come back around, but at this point is not really where we're working on in our life. But we were supposed to have like a 29-hour thesis reading with industry actors and an industry director, and none of that happened. Our program, I mean, it couldn't happen.
Yeah.
And so we kind of had like a table read with some friends over Zoom, played some demos. We had to record. Our show had 37 songs in it.
Oh my goodness.
And we recorded all 37 songs between me, Steven, and Elspeth, who was staying with me at the time.
Wow.
So that first thing that got affected during COVID was our thesis readings. Second thing, though, Tin Pan Alley 2, which I mentioned briefly earlier with Dura, we moved entirely online. So we were in person at Dixon Place, and then we transferred to doing an online format. So I got really good at video editing. Dura got really good at audio editing. Took it from there. And then the other, like, my pandemic project, my pandemic baby, was The Latest Draft, which is a podcast that can be found on Apple Music or Apple Podcasts and Buzzsprout and, like, you know, all the podcasts. I don't think we're on Spotify, but I think everything else. And I wrote, my friend Noah, who I had written with, and Elspeth, and our good friend Joe Bador, roped them all in, and we did 3 seasons. Our last episode comes out October 8th, in 2 days from now. And we produced, like 24 new musicals in an audio format, and then 6 cabarets of 10 songs each during the pandemic, up until, I guess, October 8th. So we worked really hard on that.
Yeah.
Elspeth and I were the first episode. It started because Elspeth and I wrote a 10-minute audio musical, and we were like, what do we do with this? Like, what do you do with an audio musical? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we were like, you know what? We're just going to make our own platform for audio musicals. So we did. And then the last thing that we did, Elspeth and I released an album on March 15th of 2021 called Little Love Notes from Collard and Rosenblatt. It's all streaming, and that was like a big chunk of time. We wrote 9 new songs for the album. It's 15 songs total. There are 29 performers on it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, from like Talia Suskauer, who's on tour with Wicked as Elphaba right now. She's on there. To like our friends are also, like my childhood friend Alyssa. She's also on there, and it's just like we brought together all these very cool people. But yeah, definitely changed the way I thought about theater and things that I thought were possible about theater, and encouraged me. I think with the theater community, a lot of people either like took a big step back from theater or like dove into like, what can virtual theater be? And I am one of the dove into virtual theater people.
Very cool. Yeah, you saw it as a new opportunity, because you were like, I don't want to take a vacation. I just started. I want to get into this. Yeah, that's very cool. I love hearing from people who had pandemic projects, and just kind of, that's so cool that you said, this doesn't exist. Let's create this platform. Yeah. So, okay, we've talked about all of these amazing theater endeavors. We've talked about some of the challenges you've seen happening. We've talked about the things you've been able to create in spite, or maybe even because of those challenges. But one thing that we haven't touched at is how open you've been about your mental health struggles. And quite honestly, I think some people will hear all that you've done and all that you've accomplished and said, mental health struggles, how? Where? Like, that, you must be talking about the wrong person. And I think, to me, I've been so impressed with your willingness to be open about your journey with mental health. So I was wondering if you would mind sharing a little bit about your journey with mental health and why you decided it was important to share it.
Sure, yeah. So when I was a sophomore in college, I've been seeing, therapists on and off my entire life, but I was a sophomore in college and I was having panic attacks every night. I was, very horribly depressed, and like not able to really function at that point in my life. And I went to see this amazing therapist who was like, I think you're bipolar. And I was like, oh. And I feel like I had an odd reaction where I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Let me think about that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. And then, from there, I have been diagnosed with so many things. I have borderline personality disorder, OCD, ADHD, anxiety, and depression. So, like, the whole alphabet, as my dad says. And I think I was at a point in my life where I've always been the person people could come to. And I felt like, in a way, because people would always come to me, I had to put on this strong front. And once I had been diagnosed and had some time to process what that meant to me, I realized that it's actually a really big part of my identity that I'm not ashamed of. And I'm not embarrassed to have, all these mental struggles. And so I made this big post on Instagram that was like, hey, I've been diagnosed with all these things and I'm still me. Because I think there's a really interesting power in owning the things that might bring you down.
Yeah.
And so from there, I've been really trying to bring awareness and end the stigma about talking about mental health. I used to work at a youth theater, and I had one of my students reach out to me on Instagram, my former students, and say, hey, I just wanted you to know that meant a lot to me. Like, seeing you talk about it made me feel like I wasn't alone.
That's powerful.
And I was like very touched by that, and also I was like, that's why I do this. Like, every time I post, I get a little anxiety. Because I'm like, what if some producer sees, that I'm bipolar and is like, oh, I don't want to work with her, she's bipolar. And that is nerve-wracking to me. But I also think if someone's going to do that, I probably didn't want to work with that person anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason I mentioned before of, like, someone just hearing your accomplishments, but maybe never think that there is this, that this was somebody struggling with mental health. And that's that stereotype, that association that if somebody looks fine and is accomplishing a lot, they're doing fine, can be so dangerous. Yes. So I wrote down so many things while you were talking because you said so many great things. You said there's a power in owning the things that bring you down. When do you ever feel that power, and how does that help you as you're just going along this journey?
I will give you an anecdote.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend the other day who's going through a bit of a rough patch, and I was telling him, like, you're gonna be okay, but it's okay to not be okay right now. And he was like, yeah, you're right. It is, like, it's okay for me to not be, like, my top happy self right now. And I think being able to own in myself has allowed me to give that power to other people.
Yeah.
So, I'll be having a really bad day. Like, I will sit in my bed and be like, I'm not getting out of bed. I'm, gonna drink water because I have to, but not because I want to. And then the next day, maybe a stereotype, but the next day I'll be like, oh, you know what? That wasn't so bad. I'm going to be fine today. But I think that being able to, being able to accept that maybe today is not your day is such an important thing. And it gives you so much more ownership over your own emotions if you actually let go of the control a little bit. If you're not, because no one is happy all the time. If you're happy all the time, there's probably something wrong. You're probably a robot if you're happy all the time.
Right. Check your back for some circuit board or something if you're...
Absolutely. I don't think there's as much power in putting up a front as there is in being like, you know what? It's where I am today, and tomorrow will be different, and the day after that will be different, and yesterday was different. Like, I don't know. I feel better about myself knowing that I will not stay in this place forever. Because I've accepted where I am.
Yeah. There's so many different messages out in the world, right? And I feel like one that we heard a lot when we were younger is like, never waste a day. You only live for so long. Like, so many songs written about, like, you know what I mean? Live every day to its fullest. And so I wonder if that plays into people's struggle when they can't get out of bed one day.
Yeah.
I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's funny you say that because I just thought when hashtag YOLO was such a thing for like our generation.
And YOLO means you only live once, if there are people out there wondering.
Which, sure, like, yeah, but also that doesn't mean that you have to push yourself to the limit every day. It means that, at least to me, living once means that I should be living my best life, which sometimes means taking a mental health day and saying, no, I can't go to the Ren Fair with you today because I really need a day of rest.
Yeah.
And that's how I protect myself and not only my mental state, but also my physical body, and honoring those spaces as kind of sacred in a way, you know, like this is my body and I have to listen to what it's telling me to do. And if it says, you know, sleep in today, and it's not going to negatively impact everything else in my life, you know, sometimes wake up for work, but sometimes if I've been going at full steam ahead for days on end, and I'm like, you know what? My body says take a break. It's telling me to slow down.
I'm very proud of our generation because I feel like there are more and more people like you. People who have decided putting on a strong front is not as important as being vulnerable and being open so that people don't feel so alone. So I commend you for your bravery in doing that because, like you said, you get a little anxiety every time you do it. But I think it's so important to show people everything that you just talked about. We've talked a lot about the experiences and the identities and the journeys that you've been on to bring you where you are. And now here you are. So tell us, what is coming next for you? What do you have on the horizon?
Yeah, lots and lots of busy projects at the moment. So up next, I have a little post-it note here. Up next, I'm doing a show at Green Room 42 with Tommy Ranieri called Unauthorized Witching Hour, and that is October 16th. So that is like the most immediate thing. Tin Pan Alley has a concert in October and then a concert in December. So I'll be hosting those and producing those and doing some video editing. Charlotte Lucas is October 22nd, so that was the Pride and Prejudice musical I talked about. I'm stage managing that. What else? Latest draft, I said, coming out soon. And then my big thing right now is Like the Wind, which is our queer teenagers running away from conversion therapy, December 19th and 20th, so way in the future, at The Brick in Brooklyn. Tickets are available now at www.bricktheater.com, and I think it's ER, not RE, for Brick Theater. We're also running a GoFundMe because we are bringing 6 actors from Virginia here. Yeah, they actually did it this summer. They did our first show, and so we really loved working with them, so we're bringing them all here. And going to cost some money to do that.
Yeah.
So we are running a GoFundMe from now until the show, if people want to donate to that. Yeah, and all that information, I'm getting slightly ahead of you, but all that information will be found on my social media.
That'll be so exciting. Okay, so I have 2 questions that I ask everybody who comes on the podcast. This podcast is called Generation Hope because I wanted people to hear hopeful stories from young adults. So I think your story will for sure give people a lot of hope about the future of mental health journeys, about the future of Broadway, so many things. But I would love if you could tell us what is giving you hope right now.
I think right now, in this moment, what is giving me hope is being able to be in a room with people who have empathy and who believe in the future. I have spent the last 2 weeks in the Charlotte Lucas rehearsal room and also in like the Win Zoom rooms and also Tin Pan Alley Zoom rooms, and being able to talk to people in my profession who aren't just like, wow, the world is ending, because Broadway is hitting some roadblocks. You know, it is coming back, but it's been hitting a lot of roadblocks. And I think being able to talk to people who are like, but I'm still going to create, and I'm still going to make art, and I'm still going to support art and, you know, support artists. I think that's what's giving me hope and what's given me hope the last few weeks.
Amazing. And then my last question for you is, what do you hope for? And that can be on a personal level. It can be, you know, as big or small as you want to get with it. But what do you hope for?
I hope for equity. I hope for empathy. I hope for people to see and hear and learn and get to be a part of, specifically, I guess, in my field, like art that holds room for equity and empathy. And I hope for younger generations to be able to look up to our generation and say, look what they did. They've made way for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. All right, well, you have, like you said, some super exciting things coming up. I'm sure you will have even more in the future. So where can people find you and follow what's going on with you and what you have coming next and next and next and next?
And next, yeah. So I am on Instagram. I'm Theatrically Sam. That is my Instagram handle. It is also my website, so www.theatricallysam.com. I'm also part of a joint Instagram, which is collard.rosenblatt.collabs. And there's also a website for that one, which is Collard and Rosenblatt. And that is where you can see all of my work with Elspeth. And then I mainly talk about mental health on my personal account, but it is public, so I suppose it is personal in air quotes.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much for joining me, Sam. It was so great to talk to you. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This has been Generation Hope. See you next time. Yay! We did it!
Yay!